Yeah, thanks for those questions. Yeah, the title is very provocative. Death by design. We like to think that people get sick by accident, that it's just bad luck. But what I'm trying to show in this book is actually it's not luck. For example, ask a social scientist who works with survey data, how long will somebody live? They can predict it. To give you your age, your gender, your R&D small, I'll tell you how long you live on average. Right? And so at an individual level, it seems bad luck, but at a population level, it's actually highly predictable. When you think about this predictability, it suggests, oh, there's a design, there's a plan. Why do people in this neighborhood live longer than people in that neighborhood? So I was trying to draw attention to this dimension that's within our grasp as a society, that we decide who lives and who dies. And sometimes that's deliberate. If you put a toxic waste dump or garbage dump in someone's neighborhood, or if you put a highway through someone's neighborhood, you know there'll be a lot of pollution. And we know pollution means that babies born near the highway will die at higher rates or get sick at higher rates than those who are further away from the highway. So there's not necessarily the highway person doesn't say, I want to kill these babies or I want these babies to get sick, but that's the outcome. The other term in social science, we talk about conditions of possibility, which we borrow from Immanuel Kant. And so this is like, it's not deliberate, but it's like, for example, if you put a basket of fruit in the break room, everyone will eat healthy because there's an apple to eat. But if you put alcohol in the break room, everyone will get drunk, And so you're not forcing people. But if every day you walk past an alcohol shop, you're much more likely to buy alcohol. So there are also ways in which a design, like for zoning, what's allowed to be built here, who's allowed to shop there, can result in poor health outcomes. And so that's what I mean by design. Different policies create unhealthy places. And so what I found in my study is that people in African Americans in Washington, D.C., the capital of the U.S., are much more likely to live in places that are unhealthy by design. And so I try and show this in the book. How exactly does this happen, and why does it keep repeating? I think you also asked, who are the designers? And so this is the interesting thing is it's not the obvious people. So we like to think that only people who are racist do racist things. But what I find is it's not just racist people, but also non-racist people, not just white people, but also black people. Racism can turn a group against itself, or the same with class and the same with gender. Women oppress other women. Poor people can harm other poor people. Wealthy people can harm other wealthy people. So similarly, within group sort of conflict perpetuates the larger system of inequality. And so I find the same thing in Washington, D.C. And so the designers are often people from the same group, not just necessarily people who are from the outside group. But I try and show that this is precisely how inequality works and is sustained. Often there's a joke that if you have a hammer, everything is a nail. Right? So often social scientists have a set of methods that they know, and that then determines the questions that they ask. And so my approach was sort of the opposite. I have a question, and what's the best way to answer it? So sort of like a detective. I started with interviews, and then when I did the interviews, I realized that there's a larger story going on that required me to look more broadly across topics and go back in history. I did life history interviews. And as people were talking about their lives, I realized that many different institutions were involved in shaping their health outcomes. So their family, the schools they went to, prisons, the neighborhoods they lived in. And so those are the pieces that made me start looking up. So many people mentioned they'd gone to prison. I decided, is this just because of the people I interviewed? And so I started looking into the literature and found that almost half of young black men were under criminal justice supervision by the end of the 1990s, like 49.9%. And so I realized it's not just my sample. So I need to study prison. I need to study the prison system. And so that took me up to prisons. With health, I started by being interested in HIV because I read a newspaper article saying 3% of the city had HIV. I was shocked. 7% of black men had HIV in the city, which is higher than even other countries around the world. Then I started reading and realized the city had the worst infant mortality, the worst maternal mortality, the worst homicide in the nation for a few years. And so I realized HIV is just one example of many diseases that the city has had. And so this made me start looking back historically. And eventually, let's just start from the beginning, 1790, and work forward to 2022 after COVID, because clearly there's something about the city that's making people sick, and it's not just this particular disease among this particular group of people. So the different methods came in as the project expanded in scope across institutions and going back in time. I think just a final reason why also brought in quantitative data. So I had a mentor who said demographers keep people honest. So when you have numbers, you know whether it's just a feeling or personal experience or whether it's true of the whole population. So I brought in census data, I brought in maps, I brought in crime data to try and verify how much of this is just my sample and how much of this is true in the city. So it was basically trying to follow the question. Yeah, no, I think that I like this idea too of layers, because this is what archaeologists do, right? You dig a little and find more, you dig, and there are layers to what you can find. And I think it got more and more interesting and complicated the further I dug, because many studies would just look at, if you're interested in a disease, who is sick, who is not sick, what's the age distribution of who is sick, what's the gender, and just describe the illness. Or in qualitative research, these are the 5 reasons why people get sick with HIV. And I could have stopped there, right? And so it's because I dug that I realized, it's not just HIV, also infant mortality, also homicide, and then going back in time. This was the same 5 years ago. This was the same 10 years ago, just a different disease. So it's a very useful way, I think, of doing social science. But I think you have to have patience and resist the speed or pressure to constantly publish. That is true of much social science these days. Yeah, so why DC? I think because it's the capital of the US, and it was shocking to me that the worst health in the country is in the capital city. So I start with this idea that the gap in life expectancy is widest in the capital city. There's like an 18-year difference in life expectancy between black and white men. So it's a small city, and even places that are like 14 miles apart, there's a 20-year gap in life expectancy. So I was so struck by that this is the place where all the big institutions for health, the President of the United States, the justice system, our health system are all there. So right in their own home is the worst health. So I was very puzzled by this, and so that's why I picked Washington, D.C. I talked about how I ended up going back in time, but part of it was realizing I can't understand what's happening now by looking at what's happening now. I have to go back. And so first I started from when my respondents were born, around 1950, moving forward. But then I realized I have to keep going further back. And so starting from 1790, when the city was founded, what really struck me was the repetition of history. Things just keep repeating themselves. And so you think now what's happening now is new. But I realized that the processes producing high HIV in the contemporary period were the same ones that produced high infant mortality in the past, high maternal mortality in the past, tuberculosis and other epidemics in the past. Was the same social processes that just kept repeating. And what I found was a critical factor was space, and the use of space to contain marginalized groups of people, and then disinvestment in those spaces. So once you shuttle poor people, or marginalized people, or racial minority people, or sexual minority people into particular places, and then you don't put money into those places, You put toxic dumps. I found they put garbage dumps in those neighborhoods. In different parts of the country also, they put also hazardous waste in poor neighborhoods. They put highways in poor neighborhoods. They built the public housing on environmentally poor land so that 5 years later it started flooding and fires broke out because they used poor material. And so you have layer upon layer of problems even after they moved from one place to another. And so I found that this use of space was an important way in which poor health outcomes were reinforced. So I call these spaces syndemic zones. A syndemic is when you have more than one epidemic that overlaps or interacts. And so you find the same neighborhood has the highest infant mortality, highest heart disease, highest cancer, highest homicide, the same neighborhood. And so you realize that actually it's not bad health everywhere, it's just bad health in these few neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods often have the poorest people in the city. And so we think health is about individual behavior, and it is, but it's also about the place in which people are living. So if you move people to a different neighborhood, their health will be better. And so part of what I was able to show historically was exactly how this keeps happening, who the actors were, what the policies were that produced an unhealthy place in the 1800s, that then reproduced an unhealthy place throughout the 1900s, that reproduced a healthy place, even unhealthy places, even in the last 10 years. So I'm able to show how that has a consequence for health outcomes at each historical era. I think it's very easy to be pessimistic. I call the book Death by Design, after all. It's a very depressing title. I think part of what I would say is the encouraging thing is when you take this long durée, I guess it's called, perspective, you see that it's like a pendulum. History is like a pendulum. It goes back and forth. You have progress and then you have reversals. You have progress, you have reversals. For African Americans, there was slavery, but then slavery ended. And then there was the Reconstruction period where there was a lot of freedom, economic progress. Then you had backlash. The Jim Crow era is what they call it. A reversal of rights, taking away business licenses, only could be hired as a janitor or a mail person, like a mailroom postal person by the government after having really good jobs before. But then that era ended. The civil rights movement came. So then you have progress. And so that, I think, enables us to see the current era, the Trump era, put it in historical perspective, that it's not going to be forever, and it's not really the full American story, that it does go back and forth. There's been a lot of firing of black officials in government, and more broadly, I think the New York Times reported black women lost over 300,000 jobs. And white men gained 360,000 jobs. This was an article in the New York Times in August. It's very explicit. It's not even a hidden thing that is happening. You're seeing racial inequality unfold as we speak, and it's happening very openly. But what gives me hope is, if you look at the historical sweep, this is the American story. You go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But the hope is each time it goes back, it doesn't go back as far. And so we're not going back to slavery. And maybe we're not even going back to the civil rights era, right? So even though there is a regress, we have to hope that there'll be time for progress in the future. So that's the hope I have. But in the meantime, what I call for in the book is you can't forget the people right now who are dying 20 years earlier than they should, right? There's hope for the future, but I think there has to be action in the present. I end the book with the Declaration of Independence, which the U.S. is a major document, founding document in the United States. And one of the things the document talks about is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so life is the main reason for government, is what the document says. And so the government needs to care about life expectancy, not just people making more money. And so my hope is the book provokes action on the ground, not just waiting for the time when the pendulum swings back? Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing I don't do a lot of in the book is talk about the resistance movements over time. And that's in part because I call it the book is a partial story. I'm only telling one slice of the story to really draw attention to how institutions work. But the big story of the last 2 centuries has precisely been resistance, and a lot of it has been grassroots resistance. Marching, protests, changes in the media, and a lot of changes in the courts. So Supreme Court and other courts have been a major way in which change has happened in America, especially for African Americans. And so that's exactly what's happening now. There's a lot of court cases to try and resist things that are seen as illegal or against the Constitution. There's been a lot of protests. In fact, I think there was a very big No Kings protest that was apparently the largest in U.S. history. And so there is protest. I think, too, we often forget that the U.S. is a federal country. And so a lot of things happen within states and within counties. And so this is part of the beauty of democracy. Is the government may be talking loudly at one level, but underneath there are a lot of people across both parties who are working to improve lives for people within their county or within their neighborhood. And so I have hope that there's a lot happening underneath that we're not seeing, because I think people care about the same thing regardless of their political affiliation. Everybody wants their relatives to live and be healthy. Everyone wants their relatives to have long lives. Everyone wants grandma to live a long life. And so I think underneath it all, everybody cares about the same things. They just disagree about how to get there. My hope is also underneath there's room. There's room for people to really think in my state, in my area, which are the places that are the most unhealthy and how can we improve those places. I think there's always things we don't see underneath that are happening on the ground behind the scenes. But yeah, protests, lawsuits are the main way in which progress has happened in the US. And so I'm hopeful on that score.
Sciences Po.